וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל לאמור, אישה כי תזריע וילדה זכר, וטמאה 7 ימים, כי מהן נידס תבוסת תטמא. וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, זאת תהיה תורת המצורע ביום טהרתו, והובא אל הכהן.
2 Torah portions are given for this week, Tazria and Metzora. Tazria starts with the book of Leviticus chapter 12, where it says, "Speak to the son of Israel, saying, when a woman gives birth and bears the male child." We are in a section of the Torah that deals with cleanness and uncleanness. The laws that are often taken as the health laws because of, for example, leprosy and other issues. But it is interesting how rabbis separated the laws of unclean food with the laws of clean state. Why is it so? What's the problem? Are these laws that deal with the leprosy, the childbirth, and other bloody issues, are these laws health laws? Let's look at some issues here. First of all, we have the laws of the motherhood. Then we have the laws of leprosy, which actually are in chapters 13 and 14. And then we have the laws of bloody issues. The significant difference between these laws and the laws of a clean food are in 2 aspects. Aspect number 1, the laws of unclean food are indicating the meat which is forbidden to eat. It says here in the book of Leviticus chapter 11 about different meats. Don't eat them and don't touch their corpses. Period. But what about the other laws? These laws. First of all, the word which is used for unclean meat is shikutz, which basically means excrement, while the laws about the unclean people are tameh. The tuma has one important characteristic. It's a temporary state. Look at what it says in different cases. First of all, let's look at Leviticus 15, verse 5. It says here, anyone, moreover, who touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. And also in the laws of motherhood, which we have a specific time. It says, if she bears, in verse 5, a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and shall remain in the blood of her purification for 66 days. And it's much less than with the male child, but nevertheless, in all the cases, and we have 2 distinct cases, here there is a specific time under which the person is considered to be unclean. And the 2 cases are that, like with the case of the woman who gives birth, it's the case when the specific time is defined right away. But, for example, in the case of the woman which has a bloody issue in Leviticus 15:25, now if a woman has discharge of her blood many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge, she shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity she is unclean. We can see that the uncleanness sometimes continues until the point of the particular states. And the same way with the leprous person who is unclean while he is sick. The main question which arises, we see the difference between the time and timelessness in the laws of unclean food. Never in the Leviticus 11 it says, whoever eats the pig shall be unclean until the period of time. Moreover, there is no even a hint of idea that the pig and its meat transfers any uncleanness. In fact, there is absolutely no problem in touching the live pig as well as the live dog or the live cat whose meat is prohibited for eating. This is how these laws differ. The laws prohibit certain things, while the laws of uncleanness do not seem to prohibit being unclean. In fact, it is absolutely out of control of the individual whether or not this individual is clean or unclean. These laws definitely talk and deal with the temple or with the sanctuary. It says in the book of Leviticus chapter 7, when it talks about the meat of the peace offering, if anyone who has any uncleanness or impurity attempts to eat the peace offering, this individual will be cut off from the people of Israel. This definitely indicates that the person who is in state of tumah cannot come to the temple while he is or she is tameh, the unclean. Only when the procedure of cleanliness comes, that's when a person is required to come to the temple. We touched here by saying it on two important issues. Another difference between the laws of unclean food and the laws of the tum'ah is the fact that every tum'ah requires a purification ritual. The purification ritual is described for the woman that gave birth to her child. It says, when the days of her purifications are completed for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or turtle dove for a sin offering. And in the same way with a woman who has a blood discharge, it also says, on the 8th day she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest to the doorway of the tent of the meeting. And the priest shall offer one for the sin offering and another to a burnt offering. We can see this clear distinction. There is no purification offering for eating unclean animal, because eating or not eating unclean animal is our choice and our decisions to follow the command of the law. And this is why the two chapters, 11 that talks about the unclean animals, and 12 that is talking about and over that talks about the unclean state of individuals, are separated into two parashot, because rabbis clearly understand the difference between these two uncleanness, while the uncleanness that we are studying is called the tumah, or the ritual uncleanness. What is this uncleanness all about? First of all, we have to notice that that the uncleanness is not only an unfortunate of the woman. If we look in the beginning of Leviticus 15, we have here, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. Not only a woman have this misfortune, but the man also have such a misfortune. And this discharge from the body can be anything. It can be from the infectious wound or any other type of the disease. One other situation is very important. Let's look at the way how this impurity is transferred. Every bed on which the person with discharge lies becomes unclean, and everything on which he sits becomes unclean. Anyone, moreover, who touches the bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in the water to be unclean until the evening. Everyone who comes into the contact with unclean individual automatically becomes unclean. First of all, it seems like some kind of a health law of prevention of the diseases. And it may be the case with the leprosy and with the fluid discharge from the body. But what about the woman after the childbirth? Is she contagious? Does she present any kind of a threat of being contagious? And even the woman with a blood discharge, which is probably a result of some kind of a cancerous situation, that is also not infectious. Also, in the book of Numbers, chapter 19, we have the situation when people become unclean because of the funeral. When somebody dies in their family, people will become unclean because they have to bury their loved one. And that's, again, we see this is not a matter of choice. This is a matter of situation. But we also see that they are declared unclean for an entire week. And then they have to cleanse themselves with a very interesting substance, which is the ashes of the red heifer that are mixed with the water. That doesn't seem like any kind of disinfectant. In fact, it looks like infectant. What is going on? We definitely see the ritual component of this. We definitely see that the purification occurs in a context of the temple, in a context of sacrifices. This is why when rabbis talk about in the Seder Nashim, talk about the nida, which is the part of the state of the woman, and still require the mikvah, the immersion into the mikvah. This is only a partial solution of the problem. It's quite inconsistent in rabbinic theology to determine what is still a part of the temple service and what is not a part of the temple service. While most of the temple rituals are recognized by the rabbis and therefore are put on hold until the temple is rebuilt, the nida situation seemed to be carried out, and that's why every synagogue has a mikvah, the special pool where the woman after her cycle has to go in and purify herself. Well, as we see, there is a certain inconsistency because there is no solution to the case when the woman gets sicker than just a regular menstrual cycle and has to be treated from the cancer and other procedures. And the Torah clearly requires for that particular woman to bring the sacrifice into the temple. In the Christianity, in some Orthodox particular Christianity, there is also some particular laws, generally emphasizing the issue of following the New Testament, particularly emphasizing the fact that the Gentile Christians are not the Jews, and therefore such a Jewish laws like Sabbath are not applied. The Orthodox is very, very particular when it comes to the issue of the laws of Leviticus 15. In this case, the woman who has a menstrual cycle is not allowed to enter the Orthodox cathedral. And the main reason for it, because the Orthodox cathedral is viewed as a temple. And this is why there is even some discussions about this in the Protestant circle. Because some Protestants attempt to view the church facility as a temple, of course in the conservative circles, but we can see how these rituals are tightly connected with the sacrificial temple service, because there is a specific message about it, message about God. And also it's very important to see that this particular state of uncleanness doesn't have to do anything, doesn't have anything to do with a human sin or suffering. Let's look, for example, in the way how the woman who gave the childbirth is actually cleansed. We read that this woman is supposed to bring the lamb for the burnt offering, and let's look what the priest does in verse 7. Then he shall offer it before the Lord to make an atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from her flow of her blood. That's what the sacrifice is all about. The atonement that which is Kippur is cleansing the issue of the flow of the blood. That is completely different, very different from the sin offerings, which we studied before, where it says that the priest shall make a kippur for him in Leviticus 5:30, and this will be forgiven. There is no issue of forgiveness here because there is no ethical guilt. Well, there is an issue of sin here. But this is the issue of sin that touches everyone on this earth. It's the second issue of sin, that consequences of sin to our body that made it mortal. And this is why these particular states of uncleanness are specifically selected. This is why there is no any word about the hepatitis, for example. There is no command here to look at the eyes if the eyes get yellowish, that this person has to be isolated. Or other infectious intestinal diseases. This is why the issue here is only about the visual signs of death. The same, that is why the leprosy, or in Hebrew, tzaraat, the boils on the skin are involved there, because this shows how the human body literally disintegrates because the cells are dying. And actually, every time we have the issue of female menstrual cycle, we have a dying cells, particularly eggs. And that is the visual sign of death. It's interesting what the scholars, biologists say, that the living cell somehow, mysteriously, the science doesn't know how it works, but it has a mechanism of self-destruction. And when we age, the amount of cells that we produce is much less than the amount of cells that die. And eventually our body dies. That's the main consequence of sin that entered the earth with Adam and Eve. And this is why God is showing by illustrating the people in such a state. They are like an actors on a scene. The same way as in a previous Torah portion, we discussed the Levites like an actors that perform the plan of salvation of God in front of people every day and every year. The same way the people who are struck with the disease, they become actors for God. And by not going to the temple, they are not deprived from salvation, but they are showing that the death and the presence of God cannot coexist. And with the childbirth is the same. And that's why Job says, in sin I was conceived, and in sin my mother gave birth to me. And this is why any kind of seminal discharges are making anybody unclean. Because every time the reproduction of the human being is involved, we reproduce the sinful human being. Nobody is born perfect. Nobody is born sinless. And I'm not talking here about the original sin idea. I'm talking here about the genetics. Our genetics bring death. And death is the result of sin. Our genetic brings disease, and the disease is the result of sin. This is the message of these laws that proclaim the state of death on the one hand, and when a person gets healed, the sacrifice is brought into the temple. So that through the sin offering, although there is no moral sin involved there, the uncleanness would be transferred into the sanctuary. God wants to receive that uncleanness. God wants to take it upon himself and to share the responsibility for our uncleanness. This is why in the book of Leviticus, in the next chapter, we discuss verse 16, chapter 16, verse 16, it says, and he shall make an atonement for the holy place because of impurities. of the sons of Israel and their transgressions. So two factors are cleansed: the impurity and the transgression. In Isaiah chapter 53, it says that the suffering servant takes and carries upon himself our diseases. This is why we see in our Haftarah the story of Naaman, who is healed from the leprosy. When he comes in contact with a girl who brings to him the message of God. Our God is the only one who is able to give us the new body. Our God is the only one who is able to raise us from the dead and give us these genes and destroy this mechanism of self-destruction in our cells. For our complement from the New Testament, we recommend this beautiful story, which is in the book of Matthew chapter 9, about the woman who was suffering from the blood discharge for many, many years. And she was trying to find Jesus, and she was trying to get to him, but she was going through enormous risk. Because by going through the crowd, she was touching people, making them unclean. By the way, there is no prohibition against touching the individual, because we need to care for the sick. What the Torah says is does not mean don't clean the bed for the sick people or wash their dishes. It says if you do this, you are becoming unclean too. You are co-suffering. You are codependent with your loved ones. Of course, down there on the streets, there were not, this woman didn't have her family members, so she was really risking. But she had her faith that something happens. And she touched the tzitzit that Jesus had, the fringe of his garment. And of course, in regular conditions, that would make Jesus unclean. But on the contrary, we have in the gospel, and all three synoptic gospels have this story. We have how the power comes from Jesus, and he feels that the power has came out of him, and this woman is healed. We see the power of God, who is able to free us from our body that carries death and give us the new healthy body. That's a great message. That is another symbolism that sanctuary service brings to the world, the symbolism of salvation of God and bodily resurrection.